Welcome back to the Review Den, my friends. And no, you're not getting away that easily. You can't sit through an awesome OutRun 2 review without seeing where it all began. We're jumping right back into that Ferrari to see where this crazy nonsense began. This is OutRun. As I touched on briefly in OutRun 2, developer Suzuki wanted to develop a racing game which emphasized the fun of driving. He'd shown that he had the technical programming chops with previous hits like Hang On and Space Harrier, both of which pioneered the use of Sega's superscalar technology. But now he wanted to develop a game which emphasized an obscure concept in the gaming world at the time: freedom. Sure, we have games with entire open worlds nowadays, but this was in an 8 and 16-bit era, and more importantly, in the arcades, where the emphasis was on difficulty and rotating players off the cabinet as quickly as possible. People who know the story, and for those who don't, yes, Suzuki admitted that he was inspired by the movie Cannonball Run, an American racing comedy with an ensemble cast of eccentric characters trying to win a trans-American race, the Cannonball Run. He went so far as to map out and prepare a trip following a similar route across the United States for research, but realized, and yes, I can attest to this, I live here, that unless you travel out of the way to its attractions, most of the American highway system looks pretty similar to itself. So instead he traveled to Europe, renting a BMW 5 Series in Germany and touring through Switzerland, Milan, Venice, Rome, and Monaco, where a certain bright red Ferrari Testarossa caught his eye. More on that later. So, he had the car and location themes in place, and the fast point-to-point gameplay would be aided by an upgraded superscalar arcade board specifically made to handle this game. The theme of freedom, however, was the magic that makes OutRun stand out as such an enjoyable game even 35 years later. Suzuki designed OutRun as a high-speed blast on wide roads and highways, with the only opponents being traffic and the timer. In addition, after each section, the player is able to select one of 2 different routes at a branching path, leading to one of 5 possible outcomes. This gives the game a total of 15 different locations, and again, the route taken is entirely left to the player. The locations provide increasingly difficult turns and elevation changes, leading to plenty of blind crests and snap turns, though if you watch the road signs, most everything is telegraphed in advance. Learning the route and braking just enough to not need to downshift is the winning combination. But the wild card here is really the traffic. Rather than bloodthirsty opponents that pass the player at the slightest mistake, you'll be the one weaving past traffic throughout the game. And while the cars and trucks all travel at hilariously high speeds, these are the fastest convoys and VW bugs ever. It means you won't be surprised by sudden obstacles requiring absurd reflexes. OutRun gives you plenty of time to see upcoming vehicles. The challenge is more in finding a smooth line between them, while taking into account their random lane changes. Sometimes traffic will prevent you from taking a good line through a turn, meaning you'll have to adjust strategy on the fly. Skill may be the biggest requirement, but there's no denying that luck plays a part here too. The arcade's default timer doesn't allow for any crashes if you want to finish, and getting a bad traffic setup might spell a doomed run. But this is the arcades, and whatever distance you cover, it's bound to be a wonderful experience. And accompanying that experience is another iconic part of OutRun, the music. I love how you select from radio stations before the game. Everything here just screams 90s road trip. Hiroshi Kawaguchi is a longtime composer who worked with Suzuki on games like Space Harrier and Hang On, and still works today. But the music wasn't just catchy in its own time. Today it has inspired an entirely new genre of music in the form of synthwave or chiptune music, which make use of original arcade MIDI and sound synth for instruments. You could argue that yes, artists have been using the Atari ST for this purpose for years, but it has truly exploded in popularity recently. Do a search for any synthwave, retrocore, or similar playlists, and you'll be sure to be greeted by some 1980s laser art cityscapes with DeLoreans or retro sports cars featured prominently. But now, okay, the real reason you're here. OutRun was an awesome game and a smash hit, but that doesn't do us any good if we can't play it. outside of arcades. Well, OutRun was ported to virtually every system of the time, from the Commodore 64 to the ZX Spectrum to the Sega Master System, but none of these had the horsepower to properly replicate the game, fun though they may have been. No, I'm going to cover what I consider the essentially perfect arcade ports of OutRun. They may have had some minor changes for licensing issues, and some even added features to the arcade original, but I would say it's safe to call these the best, closest ports so far. Now, it wasn't the first, but one of the first essentially perfect ports was what I would call the Shenmue port. Those familiar with the series will know that used arcade games are featured in the first two Shenmue titles, with OutRun first appearing in 2001's Shenmue 2 for Dreamcast. The Dreamcast had plenty enough power to emulate a game within a game, which was cool in itself, and the title was later released in a compilation for Dreamcast, the Japanese-only Yu Suzuki Works Volume 1. This was a great emulation of the game, although it was the first to feature some changes due to licensing issues. Okay, quick explanation. As I mentioned, Yu Suzuki saw a beautiful Ferrari Testarossa on his European trip, and decided then and there that it should be the featured car. So, they designed a convertible top-down Testarossa, drew in the sprites, complete with the prancing horse, and that was that. Only it wasn't. Ferrari is notoriously litigious about their brand and image, look up deadmau5's Ferrari, and Sega using them without permission meant that they would be hounded for years legally. Thankfully, with licenses in place, they were able to release later games like 355 Challenge and OutRun 2, but whenever the original OutRun is featured without Ferrari licensing, you're now going to see some sprite swaps, such as here. The Shenmue Testarossa loses the iconic side vents and replaces the prancing horse with ram's head? I don't know. Hey, it's a Southern Ferrari! Apparently, it's enough to avoid legal troubles, though. You'll also see some traffic modified as well. The VW Bugs now look like Fiat 500s, and the 911 turbos are replaced with a completely generic car thing. Thankfully, the Corvettes survived. Sprite changes aside, these are great versions of OutRun. Way back when I didn't have a Sega Saturn, Shenmue 2 on Xbox was my first chance to play an arcade-faithful OutRun since my childhood in the arcades, so this was pretty special. Hey, I finished something other than the Autobahn route. I remember setting aside save files just so I could play and record my best sessions, VCR tapes for the win. This port is also seen in Shenmue 2 HD, and although I can't confirm it, I believe Xbox's OutRun 2. The proper Testarossa is used here as obviously they had the license, but this uses the same traffic sprites as the Shenmue ports, which aren't used in other versions. It would make sense too, as they had already ported the game inside of Shenmue 2 Xbox, but again, I can't confirm. The next big ports were developed for Nintendo's 3DS and Switch. These were developed by Sega's own M2 Studios and add loads of awesome new features and bonuses. Again, they feature some sprite swaps for licensing. It's the Ostrich Ferrari? But content and graphics-wise, these are hard to beat. The option to expand, not stretch, the view beyond the original 4x3 is impressive, and you have the option to double the frame rate as well, to 60 frames per second. You can slide in a variety of wallpapers, including mock-ups of the arcade cabinets, and the Switch version offers screen filters to soften the image on large TVs. Far and away though, fight me, the best and most overlooked feature is for the 3DS, with the ability to not only add a tilting effect for the cabinet, but authentic cabinet sounds as well. See, while OutRun had, of course, basic stand-up cabinets like any other arcade game, the deluxe sit-down models had an awesome hydraulic tilt effect that leaned through turns and shook around during crashes. Anyone who played on this or Afterburner's cabinet will know how awesome the experience was, and seeing M2 emulate this was a huge throwback to my childhood. And as I said, there's even the option to add cabinet sounds, such as the pedals, shifters, and wheel, all recorded off an actual arcade machine. Too cool. For music, the 3DS added 2 brand new songs in addition to the original 3, while the Switch version adds 4 classic songs on top of those, and all are done using the original arcade MIDI synth. You have the option to adjust timer and traffic difficulty, which make the game more playable, and there's even the option to use the original Japanese version's map, which was slightly switched around from the later international release. Most unique, though, are the unlockable upgrades. Completing the game a few times will unlock better handling, higher top speed, quicker crash recovery, and off-road abilities, and these can be mixed and matched in any order. The Testarossa itself looks better than the Shenmue sprites, and the traffic adds back in a Porsche 911 lookalike. And finally, for convenience, you can save both your progress mid-race and replays of your favorite runs. All these options and extras make this a great package. You'd expect no less coming from developer M2. This port was also used as a basis for the arcade machines in the Yakuza games, which is appropriate considering that is the spiritual successor to Shenmue, although these lose the added content. However, if we want a truly arcade-perfect port, we're gonna have to finally look, yes, to the mighty Saturn. Those who know were waiting for this, and yes, the best or at least most accurate port of OutRun is the Sega Ages release featured in a compilation for the West or as a standalone game for Japan. Start to finish, this is pretty much a perfect port of OutRun, aside from the gear indicator. And credit to RU Turbo, or RU Turbo, for the effort. Aside from emulating the arcade game and MAME, this is as good as it gets. Even better, it features some optional enhancements of its own. Time and traffic difficulty options are available, making the game more approachable. The original Japanese map layout is available, and you can set shifting to automatic if those two whole gears are too much to you, although unlike the M2 port, this actually shifts at the optimal point. Best of all though, this offers a 60 frames per second option long before the M2 ports came around. Add in support for analog steering through the 3D control pad, and this is OutRun bliss for purists. I know the 60 frames per second isn't arcade perfect, but it actually just feels like it is. Add in all the correct original sprites, great control, and a proper Sega platform, and this is arguably the best home OutRun experience. One exclusive bit of content is a remixed soundtrack for the Japanese release, but the good news here is that Japanese Saturn games are usually really cheap, sometimes cheaper than Western releases. What it all comes down to is OutRun is awesome. Yes, emulating the game is pretty easy, even my granny laptop can do it, probably. And yes, there is even a fan-made port which offers similar updates. But among the official releases, these are the very best of the best. The Switch version is great for Nintendo owners, while the Yakuza and Shenmue HD pack-ins let Microsoft and Sony fans in on the fun. The Saturn edition is harder to acquire, but for retro fans, it's hard to beat. Whatever version you find though, it's well worth the fun. Sometimes, the very best edition of a game is the one you simply get to play. We're all gamers here. Thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you, and if you'd like to help my channel grow, maybe watch some of my other videos. I'll be back soon with another review, and no matter what, be sure to keep going, even when things get tough, because you are worth it.